Hello everyone and Assalamu alaikum. Welcome to the next part of the previous lecture where we were talking about providing meaningful names not only to variables but also the classes and methods that we write inside the classes. In the previous part we talked about few guidelines that we can use for providing meaningful names in our source code. To be more specific, we talked about using intention revealing names, we talked about avoiding disinformation, and also we mentioned that the names that we use should have a meaningful distinction. Also, the variable names or the class names or the method names that we use should be pronounceable. Today we are going to talk about some other guidelines that we can follow for providing meaningful names to the variables, classes or functions inside our code. So let's get started. So one of the very good advice that we should be using is that our variable names or class names or even the method names or any names that we use in our code should be searchable. Because most of the times we spend a lot of cases where we need to search for a name of the variable that we have already created, or we might need to search the name of the variable that is already created and we are using it at other places in the code. Well, to be specific, the single letter names and numeric constants have a particular problem in that they are not easy to locate across the body of the text or the code that we have already written. So let's suppose, for example, we want to give or use the number 7 somewhere. It is recommended that instead of using this hard-coded value, we should be using a named constant which actually shows the intention, which has a meaning, and it can also be searched across the code. Similarly, if we use single letter names, they are considered to be a poor choice because it is very difficult to search them across the code. Well, a rule of thumb says that the length of the name should correspond to the size of the scope. That means if our scope is limited, we can use small letter or smaller length names, but if the scope of the variable or the scope of the method is large, so for example if we are creating a variable that is going to be used across the class, then that name should follow the guidelines that we have talked already, like it should be intention revealing. The name should be easily searchable across the code because you will be dealing more with that variable as compared to the variable which is having a smaller scope or which is a local variable of a function, for example. So if a variable or constant might be seen or used in multiple places, then that variable of course needs to be searched more. So you should try to give a search friendly name to that type of variables. Well, for the exact comparison, you can have a look at this code, which is very problematic in a sense that it uses the variables which are single letter variables. So for example, the name of this array is named as T. Also, there are some constants which are being used and it is completely not known that what is the purpose of those constants. So I usually name them as magic numbers. This number 34 is also a magic number. Well, we can very easily compare that above code with an improved version of the same code, जहाँ पे आप लोग देख सकते हैं कि we have replaced the constants with the names. So basically we have created or used the named constants like work days per week. So this 5 was actually the work days per week. Similarly, we had real days per ideal day. So this 4 is actually representing this value, and similarly this 34 is replaced with a named constant which is called a number of tasks. So basically if you just look at this code, which is an improvement over the previous one, you can see that the names are definitely more searchable, and because the names are searchable, we will be easily fixing or updating that code if required in the future. Well, the next guideline talks about in a very similar fashion जैसे कि हमने पहले बात की थी about the noise words. So in this guideline we talked about avoiding encodings in our variables. So encoding is basically an additional information that we attached with any type of variable. So basically I'm encoding the name of this variable count by using some additional characters or some additional words which can also be considered as the noise words, जिससे मैं ये पता चला रहा हूँ कि this count variable is a global variable. यहाँ पर ये encoding मुझे ये बता रही है that this phone variable is actually of type string. So encoding type और scope information into the names of the variables जिस तरह से यहाँ पर हमने किया is completely discouraged or is not recommended. Sometimes we try to encode or prefix our variables with m underscore. So just to mention or just to tell that this variable is a member variable or is a member of the class, we encode the name of the variable with some additional combination or single characters. That should also be discouraged. Similarly, if we are declaring an interface, instead, like the name of our interface is shape factory, I can encode that shape factory name with an additional letter which is called I, just to represent or just to tell that this is an interface. Well, that also is discouraged. We should not be encoding our names. Rather, I can simply use the name as shape factory, and the use of the shape factory will automatically let the reader or let the developer know कि जो shape factory है, this is not a class, rather this is an interface. Well, in this code, we can see that we are encoding the scope information in the name of the variable by providing some additional letters and characters. Well, we can avoid that and use more meaningful names by simply using the names without any additional encoding. Another rule of thumb that we should कीप इन माइंड जब भी हम वेरिएबल्स को या जब भी हम कहीं पर भी नाम इस्तेमाल कर रहे होंगे, दैट इज़ क्लैरिटी इज़ किंग. बाय क्लैरिटी वी मीन कि हमें किसी भी ऐसी सूरत हाल को पैदा नहीं करना चाहिए जहाँ पर वी रियली नीड टू मेंटली मैप अ नेम टू अ नेम दैट वी ऑलरेडी नो. सो रीडर्स शुड नॉट हैव टू मेंटली translate your names into other names that they might already know. So for example, we are creating a loop variable, and generally we know that loop variables are like I, J and K if we are working in a nested loop. So you should always be using I, J and K. Instead, well, the poor approach will be that instead of using I, J and K, you are using the variables like A, B and C. So in that case, I really have to mentally map that A corresponds to I, B corresponds to J and C corresponds to K. So they say that one basic difference between a smart programmer and a professional programmer is that the professional programmer understands that clarity is king. So when I'm using I, J and K, my code will automatically be clear. The loop and its working and its iteration will automatically be clear to everyone who is reading the code. Instead, अगर मैं A, B, C इस्तेमाल करूं तो पहले मुझे ये सोचना पड़ेगा, अच्छा यार I का मतलब या A का मतलब जो है that is I, B का मतलब जो है वो J है and C का मतलब जो है वो K है. Similarly, जब हम classes का नाम रख रहे हों तो the name of the class should not be a verb, because whenever I see a verb, I will assume that this is the name of a function. So if that is actually a class, every time I see the name of a class which is actually a verb, I will have to mentally translate it कि जी this is not a function बल्कि ये एक class है. So classes and objects should have noun or noun phrase names like customer is a class name, wiki page, account, address parser is a class name. और in contrast to that, अगर आप किसी function का नाम रख रहे हो तो they should not be nouns or noun verbs or noun phrases. In fact, not noun verbs. They should not be nouns or noun phrases. They should be verbs. ठीक है? Like for example, if you're naming a class, you should not name a class like processor, like manager, and so on. So when I'm naming functions, I should be using appropriate verbs as the name of the functions. So for example, you can use the name as post payment. Now it automatically tells me कि ये एक function का नाम है. It's a functionality. It's some action which is being taken place. So instead, if I give the same name, this same name to a class, तो मुझे I will really have to mentally map this name every time I am using that particular class. So please try to avoid that. Delete page is a good name, save is a good name, but not for the class but for a function. Similarly, when you are overloading the constructors, it's better like not to use this form जो कि हम ऑलरेडी इसको इस्तेमाल करने के आदी हैं. You would be assuming कि सर हमें ये क्यों कह रहे हैं. When you are overloading the constructors, you should use static factory methods with the names that describe the arguments. So for example, I want to have a constructor which creates that complex class type object. ये complex class का object बनाता है by taking that float value or that real number. So instead of using this format, मुझे क्या करना चाहिए? I should be creating a static method, a static factory method. So I can call that factory method directly, static method directly on the name of the class, or that I can name the method जिसको पढ़कर I can assume and I can understand that what type of object it is going to return me. So it says from a real number. So ये जो approach है, it really does not tell कि ये जो constructor है ये किस type का object जो है वो return करेगा. Whereas in the previous case अगर मैं देखूं तो it really tells me exactly कि मुझे real number से एक complex number जो है वो मिलने जा रहा है. So we can of course enforce this type of behavior. हमें internally हमें definitely we will need this constructor, but what we can do is we can set this constructor as a private constructor, and in this way we will be able to enforce the users of our class to use this method instead of calling this constructor. And guys, remember, whenever you're coding, please do not be cute. Well, by being not cute, we mean that whenever you're writing the code, you should be picking the names that you're using or that you're writing in your code very carefully, in a sense that your names should be very formal. Your purpose, your focus is not to entertain the reader of your code or the user of your code. Rather, your focus or your basic primary objective is clarity of your code. So you should always choose clarity over the entertainment value. That means, so for example, if I'm creating a method whose purpose is to delete or destroy anything, so I should not be using any informal terminology or a slang terminology or a slang name. Rather, I should be using a proper name which actually tells the intention, which is easy to use, easy to pronounce, which is searchable, and we should be keeping in view all the guidelines that we have already gone through. But the important thing is कि आपको informal नहीं होना. आपका मकसद किसी को entertainment value provide करना नहीं है या कोई slang इस्तेमाल करना नहीं है. Rather, you should be using the names which are more formal, which are more closer to the domain जिसके ऊपर आप काम कर रहे हो. So I can conclude that by saying that say what you mean and you should mean what you say. So you should be very much straightforward instead of being cute. Try to be as formal as possible. Well, in short, मैं ये कहूँगा कि हीरो बनने की ज़रूरत नहीं है. आपको आपका जो कोड है उसके ऊपर फोकस करना है एंड बहुत लिमिट्स के अंदर रहते हुए अपने नामों का चुनाव करना है. अच्छा, एक और बहुत ज़्यादा जो कॉमन मिस्टेक हम करते हैं वो ये है कि वी टेंड टू चूज़ डिफरेंट वर्ड्स फॉर अ सिमिलर कॉन्सेप्ट एट डिफरेंट प्लेसेस इन द कोड. हम अपने ही कोड के अंदर एक ही जगह, इनफैक्ट मल्टीपल जगहों पर एक ही कॉन्सेप्ट को या एक ही काम को करने के लिए मुख्तलिफ नामों का इस्तेमाल करेंगे. सो हमने एक क्लास के अंदर डिलीट का मेथड लिखा जस्ट टू डिलीट अ रिकॉर्ड। एक और क्लास के अंदर हम लोग जस्ट टू डिलीट हम लोग जो है डिस्ट्रॉय का वर्ड इस्तेमाल कर लेंगे। एंड देन वी गो इन अ थर्ड क्लास और वहाँ पे हम कोई भी तीसरा सिनोनिम जो है वो यूज़ करते हैं। Probably this is not intentional, but unintentionally we tend to pick different words for a single concept. So the guideline says that you should always pick one word per concept. So for example, somewhere in the code you're using the word fetch, later on you use the word retrieve, and then at some other place you use the word get, and at some fourth place you might be using a read, for example. So that should be avoided, because the readers and the users of the code will be confused remembering or differentiating that what is the difference between fetch, retrieve and get in the different classes. Similarly, it's confusing to have a controller. Some places you use manager, and then at some places you use driver. Well, all of these three are actually a same concept and different names of the same concept. So you should be very much consistent whenever you are using a singular concept at different places of the code. So basically that can be done by choosing an appropriate name which is consistent across all the classes जो आपके कोड के अंदर मौजूद हैं. The name leads you to expect two objects that have very different type as well as having different classes. So basically मुझे ये लगेगा कि ये दोनों जगहों पर ये जो different आपने नाम इस्तेमाल किए हैं इनका purpose भी मुख्तलिफ है. And in contrast to the previous concept जिसकी मैंने बात की कि आपने एक ही concept के मुख्तलिफ नामों को इस्तेमाल नहीं करना. In contrast to that, you should not be using same word for different purposes. यानी अब आपने एक ही नाम को मुख्तलिफ concepts के लिए भी इस्तेमाल नहीं करना. Because if the purpose and the functionality is different, then of course the names should be different. They should not be synonyms. So, well, the guideline says that do not pun. So by pun we mean that we are using the same term for two different ideas. So whenever we are doing that, that means we are essentially doing a pun. So if you follow the one word per concept rule जो कि हमने अभी पहले बात की, you could end up with many classes that have, for example, an add method. Of course हमने कहा that you should be consistent with the names. अगर मैं कुछ records add करना चाह रहा हूँ and ये functionality is present in different classes, so the names should be consistent. So well, in this principle हम ये कह रहे हैं that अगर एक जगह पर आप add कर रहे हो और दूसरी जगह पे आप append कर रहे हो, now add and append are completely different concepts. So you should be using different names for those different concepts. So it says that as the semantics are different, by adding we mean that we are completely inserting something new, whereas by appending that means we are modifying the already existing stuff or existing record and adding to that particular record which already exists. It's not the new record. So when the semantics are different, you should name them differently, like insert whenever you want to add a new record, and append when, for example, you want to have something new or some modification to the already existing record. Well, the next guideline says that you should use solution domain names. That means, so for example, you're working on a project where आप searching कर रहे हो या sorting कर रहे हो, तो आप लोग जो variables के नाम इस्तेमाल करोगे, they should be taken from the domain. They should be taken from the search algorithm जिस पे आप काम कर रहे हो. So मिसाल के तौर पे pivot is a technical name and it's a name from the domain of a particular searching or sorting algorithm. So आपके जो नाम हैं, they should actually be from your domain, from your algorithm, from your computer science domain. So you should be taking care that the reader of the code actually does not have to translate your name and learn a new concept to understand what is the mean of that particular class, variable or a function name. And finally, the last guideline of today's discussion and this lecture is that we should not be adding the context or extra context or unwanted context in our names. So for example, the names account address, customer address are fine if they are the names of your reference variables or the names of your objects. But if I say that these are the names of my classes, then I'm actually adding some extra context to the name. This account and this customer are giving an extra context to my address. So basically address itself is a fine name for a class. Now let's say for example I want to differentiate between different type of addresses, like for example for the network I want to differentiate between MAC address, between the port address and the web address. So instead of using that prefix or the suffix with every name like MAC address, port address or web address, I can get rid of that unwanted context by simply choosing some appropriate or different names. Like I can choose the names to be postal address, I can choose the name as MAC or URI. So simple names which actually tell the difference and which tell the purpose, and they also help me avoid the unwanted context. Also, it is a bad idea to prefix every class name with some fixed prefix like your application name. So that is also an unwanted context, or you can also say sometimes that is an example of the noise word, जैसे हमने start में और पहले किसी principle में बात की थी. Like for example मेरा system है या मेरा जो project है उसका नाम है Gas Station Deluxe और that's the name of my company. तो what I do is कि मैं अपने हर टेबल से पहले हर वेरिएबल से पहले I prefix the names with some specific short form or some specific combination of the letters like GSD. So I can have like GSD account address, GSD employee. So in that case what I can observe is that this GSD and this GSD here are actually having or providing me unwanted context which must be avoided. So shorter names are generally better than the longer ones so long as they are clear. So your name should be as long as required, but should not be having some unwanted, noisy and extra context based words or characters. Well, finally, just to conclude that long discussion, we can definitely say that whenever we are improving someone's code and whenever we are changing the names or following these guidelines, we will definitely see improvement in our code. And by following some of these rules, you will actually see that you definitely not only improve the overall sense of code, but you also improve the readability at the lower level. And if you're maintaining someone else's code, you can really do or follow and implement those guidelines and rules by probably using the refactoring tools, by searching and replacing the names. So probably I'm not writing the new code, but I'm fixing or improving the already existing code, then I can definitely follow this technique. And if I rigorously follow those principles and learn and adopt them for my future development, they will definitely pay off in the short term and continue to pay me in the long run by improving the quality of my code, which is one and basic principle of software construction. So definitely by adopting these principles, we can improve the quality of our code. We can achieve the objective that we are actually looking for, which is writing quality or writing better code. With this, I will stop here and see you in the next lecture, and thank you.